Well, hey guys, it's Mr. Schaber, and welcome to our presentation on post-World War II and the Cold War. I first want to start out by showing you a number of political cartoons and just talking about them for a minute. So this first one, you can see Uncle Sam and a bear, right? When World War II ends, there are basically two countries that are dominant in the world, and it's the United States and the Soviet Union. Of course, the United States is represented by Uncle Sam, and the Soviet Union in this case is represented by the Russian bear, who was Joseph Stalin. Stalin was the dictator of Russia, and he had tried to drive a hard bargain in World War II with Roosevelt, with Churchill, with Truman, as far as what he wanted after the war. And so when the war ends, he doesn't change his stance. He continues to really try to play hardball. And the Allies, the United States and Britain and France, are going to have to try to deal with Stalin because he wants to create basically a Russian empire, a Soviet empire, in Asia and Eastern Europe. And so this is going to be an interesting thing. So as we start talking about the Cold War, keep in mind there are these two dominant superpowers, and they're going to be going kind of head to head as far as well, in multiple ways, economically, politically, and trying to have an influence on other countries as well. Here's another cartoon with, of course, the American eagle and the Russian bear. All right, and the chasm, the gulf between them, caused by irresponsible statements and deepening suspicions. We thought the Soviets wanted to take over the world, and I'm sure they thought the same thing about us. And so there's this animosity that develops, and it probably was heightened by media. Honestly, I think the average American and the average Russian probably didn't, weren't as worried about things as maybe the media uh, made things out to be, or political leaders made things out to be. But you know, nevertheless, it was still a time of tension, great tension between these two countries. This is a classic, right? Two Santa Clauses, one American, one Soviet, and they each have their presents in their bag, and they're trying to go down the same chimney. Now, that chimney could represent, a foreign country, a different country that both the U.S. and the Soviet Union want to have an influence in, and so you can see what their presents are, right? Um, we're going to build things for you. We're going to give you money. We're going to, things like that. And so we're trying to have influence in other countries, but so were the Soviets, and it was often a battle over who was going to win the most influence in that country. Here's Joseph Stalin portrayed as trying to rearrange the map, right, and trying to create a Soviet empire that he could rule over and create quite a buffer zone of countries around the Soviet Union that he would have, for protection as well. This one shows that after the war, one of the ways we got into foreign countries or into other countries was through the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan, as we will see, was named after George Marshall, a top government official in the U.S. And it was kind of the Marshall Plan was kind of his brainchild, along with some other guys as well, to pump money and resources into Europe and other places to rebuild them after World War II, and also to kind of win influence there. And so this one shows, we're on the tractor. The Marshall Plan is pretty efficient. It's going well. And the Soviets, their Marshall Plan, their idea, their version of it was to go into foreign countries, other countries, and enslave the people, so to speak, and make them do all the hard work and pillage their resources and things like that. So obviously, these political cartoons are from an American perspective. They're going to make the United States look like the good guy and the Soviets look like the bad guy. But anyway, that's what this cartoon shows. We will talk about this, but Winston Churchill calls what Joseph Stalin is doing in in Eastern Europe, he calls Stalin out for building what he calls an Iron Curtain, the Iron Curtain of communism. And when communism takes over an area, it is like a wall, an iron curtain that cannot be moved, it cannot be penetrated. Once communism is in a place, it doesn't leave that place. It stays, and it's going to terrorize the people, as you can see. So that's what's portrayed here. Same type of deal, right? You got the wall that's put up, and it looks like Churchill, right? Trying to look underneath the wall. No admittance by order of Joe, right? Joseph Stalin. But you got the wall up, and whether that's the Berlin Wall, right, in Berlin, Germany, or whether that's just the Iron Curtain wall of communism, can be up for some interpretation. But the effects are basically the same. Is that you're cutting off one side from another, and the side behind the Soviet wall was brutal, was tough. Okay, of course the Russians are going to make it look like everything's great, but other people, realize what's going on. The Cold War was a time, as I mentioned, of just crazy tension. World War III was always around the corner. It was going to happen at any time, people thought. And so both sides here are shooting arrows at each other, but they have nuclear weapons, bombs, rockets, at their disposal, ready to shoot as well. Okay, so the Cold War is a lot of arrow slinging, but always the threat, so to speak, of something way worse, the atomic or nuclear age. Okay, and so this is what the Cold War is really about, as we will see. Is a lot of threats, a lot of stare downs, a lot of what are you going to do next? Okay, I challenge you, I dare you. But luckily, we never actually went to World War III, but it was close. And here you go with, this is a classic, right? John F. Kennedy, the United States President, Nikita Khrushchev, who will become the Soviet premier, basically dictator, and they're arm wrestling, and both of them have their fingers right next to the button that's connected to the bomb the other guy's sitting on. So we're close to war. We could detonate these bombs at any time. We could start launching things at each other, but somehow we avoided it. But it was dang close numerous times. And but yeah, this I think this political cartoon is spot on. It really gets the meaning across. And finally, after about 45 years of this jockeying back and forth, of struggle for supremacy in other countries, of intimidation and competition and you name it, the United States and the Soviet Union finally see a reprieve in their Cold War, and the world does as a result, because the Soviet Union will crumble. It will fall. Communism will fall there. And so when communism falls in the Soviet Union, it not only makes Russia go back to just being Russia, because the Soviet Union was Russia, the Russian Empire. It was Russia with a bunch of other countries that they had taken over. But when the Soviet Union crumbles, now Russia goes back to being Russia, and the Ukraine is the Ukraine again. And these other countries that were part of the Soviet Empire are each their own entities again. And this is world changing, of course. This happens 1989, 1990, 1991 is when this process is occurring. And so this is going to change the outlook about a lot of things, both on the American and Soviet ends of the spectrum, and for everybody in between, right? And so this is a great day, though. It's a great day as far as what we consider, a great day here in the United States, because evil communism has fallen, right? And we see we've proven that it couldn't work, and it failed in the end, and also then the Soviet brutal influence that was in some of these other countries is now going to be leaving. So if we had to sum up then What is the Cold War? Well, the Cold War, like I said, starts right when World War II ends, and it goes until officially 1991. So 46 years of a time of competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, right? For power, for influence. Uh, it was a competition in everything you can imagine, from who has the bigger military to who has the best technology and weapons to who can build the biggest bombs, who has the most atomic bombs or nuclear bombs, uh, who wins the most gold medals in the Olympics every 4 years. I mean, those everything was a competition. And of course, the Soviets are trying to show that communism is better than democracy, and we're trying to show that democracy and capitalism is better than communism. And and so therefore, as I wrote there on the bottom, the Cold War is characterized by political and economic conflict and military tensions between the two nations. Political conflict of war of the systems, communism and democracy, communism, capitalism, and military tension. We never actually fight the Soviet Union in a war. That would have been World War III. But there are wars that happen during the Cold War. Hot wars, we call them, wars that actually do occur where bullets are flying, where the Americans and the Soviets will have influence in. But we never actually fight the Soviets directly. Well, how does the Cold War get started? Well, that answer lies in just before World War II ends. Before the war ends, uh, Joseph Stalin met with Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt when Roosevelt was still alive before he passed away. And at their meeting, uh, they knew that the Allies were going to win the war. It was just a matter of time. And so the question was, what do we do with Europe after the war? Joseph Stalin was insistent that he get Germany. I want Germany, he says. They've caused massive damage in my country, which they have. They've killed many of my people, my soldiers, which of course the Germans did. But he says, I want all of Germany. And Churchill and Roosevelt said, no, 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 there's no way you get all of Germany. And so what they agreed upon was that Germany would be divided into a west section and an east section. Now, the west section you can see here on both maps is divided into three zones itself, one American zone, one British zone, and one French zone. And it was to be a democracy and a capitalistic system as far as you could. Those were to be set up in the west section, the West Germany. Okay, and so that was what the Allies got. Meanwhile, Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union got East Germany. And this part had Berlin, it had Dresden, and this was set up to be communist. The Soviets were going to absolutely implement their style of government and economics there. And what the Soviets really did was went in and just pillaged uh, everything of value and shipped it back to Russia. Okay, they brutalized the German people. They blamed them for the war. When it wasn't the average German person's fault, of course, it was Hitler's and his top brass, and they were all gone or had fled. And um, so the Soviets do some massive damage and brutalizing of East Germany. But that's how this whole thing is divided up. West Germany to the Allies, East Germany to the Soviets. And this is going to cause some major tension, obviously. So Germany is going to kind of be the heart of the Cold War, if you will, as far as the symbol of the Cold War for decades to come. Also, right at the end of World War II, the United Nations is formed. And the United Nations is formed to be an international peacekeeping organization. Okay, the idea was that countries would talk out their problems and not fight over them. And so the first United Nations was set up in San Francisco, and eventually it moved to New York City. And today it's in New York City. And so there's the UN building you can see. There's inside there on the left and the outside of it on the right, with all the flags flying. And the idea is that foreign countries will all send that want to be part of the UN will send a representative to live in the U.S. and they will represent that their home country in the United Nations. And when they meet, they talk out their issues, and they're not supposed to fight about them. Now, we've had wars since 1945 in the world, so the UN hasn't been able to officially, to keep us war free by any means. They've done some good things and some not so good things, okay, in their time in existence. But that's what the UN is, and it's basically a continuation of kind of the League of Nations. If you remember, after World War I, the League of Nations was started, but the United States never actually joined that group, and the United Nations is different. The U.S. will join the United Nations after World War II, and we become a major player in the UN. Winston Churchill is invited by President Truman after the war to visit President Truman's home state of Missouri. And he goes to a little town, they both go to a little town in Missouri, and Churchill gives a famous speech. It's come to be known as the Iron Curtain speech. In that speech, Churchill warns the West and warns the United States that Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union are trying to create an iron curtain of communism in Eastern Europe. And he was right on. He absolutely was right on. Stalin was doing that. And so the Iron Curtain is what we call the Soviet Union's attempt to take over other countries, make them communist, and create a barrier of communism in the world. And so what you can see there on that map, that green line, is as far as Stalin got, the Iron Curtain Trail, if you will. And you can see all the countries that got taken over and trapped behind the Iron Curtain before it was all said and done. From Estonia to Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, which was Czechoslovakia at the time, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and then of course East Germany. And so Stalin really does a number on Eastern Europe and really starts creating an empire there. As mentioned during the political cartoons, George C. Marshall, a Secretary of State, a military guy during World War II, Joint Chiefs of Staff, head in World War II for the United States. He comes up with a plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. Europe is in shambles. Countries are devastated. Landscapes are transformed. Lives have been completely, turned upside down. People's homes are destroyed. Buildings are destroyed. Roads, bridges, you name it. Okay, there's not enough food to go around, things like that. And so Marshall comes up with this plan. I mean, can you imagine trying to create a plan like this and figuring out logistics and how much money you're going to need and who's going to do what and everything? But his plan is we have to rebuild Europe. And by doing so, let's face it, American money is going to go a long way toward hopefully buying some influence as well. So we're going to rebuild these countries, and we're going to help them see how great capitalism and democracy are, and we'll try to influence them to set up systems like that in their countries if they don't already have them. And so definitely the Marshall Plan was at least twofold in its purposes, and it's pretty effective. We do rebuild a lot of Europe. Tons of American money and time and resources are dumped in, and most of Western Europe stays free from the grasps of communism. Well, if there was any true symbol of the Cold War, if there was one place you could look and say, yep, that's the Cold War defined, it's the city of Berlin. Now, I mentioned before that Stalin got Berlin, Stalin had Berlin in his East Germany. But the Allies, when they were talking way back before World War II ended, Churchill and Roosevelt said, wait a minute here, we can't give you all of Berlin. I know Berlin's in the east section of Germany, but you're not getting the whole thing. Berlin is the most powerful city. It was, the capital. We're not giving you the whole city of Berlin. And so Stalin really fought him on that. And the Allies said, no, you're not getting the whole thing. What we're going to do is we will divide it basically in half, kind of like we did with the country. West Berlin will be controlled by the Allies. East Berlin will be Soviet controlled. So West Berlin was controlled by the U.S., mainly the U.S., but also had some British and French influence in it. And East Berlin was the Soviet Union. Well, Stalin is forced to agree to this, okay, but he thinks, okay, fine, I'll make life miserable for them, because for the Allies, because yes, West Berlin will be supplied and clothed and and fed by the United States and Britain and France. But they need our roads in East Germany to get into Berlin. They need to drive those supplies in. And so what Stalin does is he decides he's going to be a pain in the neck, like usual, and he closes the roads that lead, closes the East German roads that lead into the city of Berlin, into West Berlin, so the Allies can't take supplies in. So what happens as a result? Well, the Allies had to decide, all right, do we just give up the section of West Berlin and just turn it over to the Soviets? Or do we find another way to supply those people with the food and medicine and clothing they need to survive? Well, let's find out the answer. The answer is the Berlin airlift. And this is kind of the ultimate in-your-face move that the United States does towards Stalin. Because the Soviets blocked the roads into West Berlin, the Allies decided, okay, we can't drive stuff in, so we will fly things in. We'll fly food and supplies. You know, there are 2.5 million people in West Berlin that are relying on us for supplies. The city of Berlin and the country of Germany in general was destitute. The people didn't have food, they didn't have enough clothing, they didn't have enough medicines and supplies, and so they were relying on the United States in West Germany and West Berlin for those things. And so from February of 1948 until May of 1949, basically 15 months, the Allies made over 200,000 flights to bring supplies in to West Berlin, to keep those people alive, and to keep, and to prevent Stalin from taking over that half of the city. And so this Berlin airlift is amazing. It's so cool, if you ask me, because it shows that the Allies were not going to give in to Stalin, and they're going to save these people's lives, and they were going to show the world what the United States was capable of and who we really are if we put our minds to it. So the Berlin airlift was a big success overall. And finally, in May of 1949, Stalin, realizing that, well, okay, this hasn't worked. They haven't given me West Berlin, and they're still getting supplies in. Stalin lifts the blockades on the roads, and the Allies are able to drive things back in from then on. So after World War II, it doesn't take long. With the United States heading up one team, if you will, and the Soviets heading up another team, for two sides to develop, two teams to form. One is called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and this was a group that banded together to fight communism. NATO is the dark blue on this map, with the light blue as allies of the US, not necessarily members of NATO, but allies. And then the opposing side was the Warsaw Pact. This is the military alliance between the Soviet Union and its communist satellite nations, or that was a fancy way of basically saying its colonies, if you will, the countries it had taken over in Eastern Europe. And so you can see that the Warsaw Pact is the dark red, with the light red being allies or countries aligned to the Soviet Union. And so this becomes kind of a worldwide struggle, though, right? Was a country going to be pro-capitalist and democracy, or were they going to be pro-communist? And this is, again, this is all intertwined. This is where the U.S. is trying to go in and rebuild places, or basically give a bunch of money to countries to say, hey, you're going to be on our side, right? You're going to support capitalism and democracy. And the Soviet Union's trying to do the same thing, although they would not usually throw the money down that we would. Or the resources. They would try to go in and just force their way in. They would try to go basically take over an area and bully the country into supporting the Soviet Union. So it was maybe a different style of approach, okay, but the goal was the same, trying to get as many places as you could on your side, to NATO or friends of NATO or to the Warsaw Pact or friends of Warsaw Pact. So that's how this worked. Another symbol of the Cold War, like I said, was who can build the biggest, baddest weapons. Because he who has the biggest, baddest weapons, he really has the upper hand, yes? I mean, just look at World War II, and we were the only ones that had the atomic bomb, and we used it at the end, and nobody could do anything about it, right? And so after the atomic bomb, here's what happens. Let's go back. We have the atomic bomb in 1945. The Soviets get the atomic bomb, develop their own by 1949. Now, at first, we were wondering how in the world did they develop an atomic bomb? Okay, so once the Soviets have an atomic bomb, we have to develop something better, yes? That's how this thing works. It's how the Cold War and competition works. And so the United States develops the hydrogen bomb, also known as the thermonuclear bomb, which is many times more powerful than an atomic bomb. Can you imagine that? Many times more powerful. And so we have this thermonuclear bomb, and we think, okay, we're way ahead again. We got the Soviets where we want them. And lo and behold, the Soviets develop a hydrogen bomb not long after we did. I think only 9 months or so after we demonstrate ours. And we are scratching our heads wondering what is going on here? How could they do that? And they've caught up with us again, right? And so this just takes the Cold War up to another level, right? Now they have the atomic bomb, so we developed the hydrogen bomb. Now they have the hydrogen bomb, so what are we going to do? And this is going to be crazy. So each country is just going to be, tireless in its quest to develop bigger and better weapons. Well, it's also at this time, 1949, when we're developing and the Soviets are developing the thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb, that a major loss for the US happens. And that loss comes in the form of China. Starting in 1947, China got plunged into a civil war. And Mao Zedong was the leader of the communist forces trying to take over China. And for a couple of years, this civil war goes on, and it turns nasty. And by 1949, Mao and his communist followers win the civil war. Now, the United States was supporting Mao's opponents in the civil war, and like I said, Mao wins. So the guys we were supporting lost, and basically by default, then we lost, right? And so communism takes hold in China. China becomes a red country, just like the Soviet Union. Now, China is huge. It's the most populous country in the world at the time and still. And so having China fall to communism, and which is, our arch enemy, okay, now we have the Soviet Union and China to deal with as far as communism goes. And so this is a big setback for freedom and democracy in the world. So now we have to deal with this guy, and we got to deal with the Soviet Union. And it's going to be tough, right? And we know we have our work cut out for us. So that is what happens with Mao taking over China. Well, a few years go by after Mao takes over, and we have an election, a presidential election, and the election of 1952. And the United States by now, President Truman was our president. He took over in 1945 after FDR died, and he got reelected in 1948. So Truman has served for 7 years. And the American people see what has happened in China. They see how Russia, the Soviet Union, has basically kept up with us as far as the weaponry goes and the technology. And it's time for a hardcore anti-communist to be elected president. And we get that in the form of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower, of course, was a World War II top general. He was the head general of all Allied forces, the supreme commander of all Allied forces in Europe in World War II. And he wins the election of 1952 and gets sworn into office in 1953. And so with Eisenhower, Ike, as he was known, as president, the U.S., the American people feel good. They feel confident that he's going to take a strong anti-communist stance and that we're going to pull back ahead in this Cold War. Well, in some ways we do, and in some ways we don't. But Eisenhower will serve 2 terms. He will um, leave office in January of 1961 after serving his 2 terms. And so what happens during those 8 years? Well, by and large, it's a great time to be in the United States. The 1950s were a glorious period for most people, or for a lot of people, economically especially, and just standard of living just rose like crazy in the United States. But Cold War speaking, we had our ups and downs. Now you may be wondering, as I mentioned to you, that the Soviets got the atomic bomb in 1940, or they develop it, I believe it was 1949, and then we have the thermonuclear hydrogen bomb, and then they develop one like 9 months after us. Okay, well, how in the world did they do that? Well, part of it was they had some really good German scientists that they had taken, okay, after World War II, but also part of it appears to be that they were given or passed atomic secrets from Americans who were traitors to the country. And 2 of them are in the form of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a married couple who were accused of passing these atomic secrets to Russia during World War II. And they are in a highly publicized trial. They are convicted of espionage and executed in 1953. So this couple was accused of, working for the U.S. government, having access to our secrets, and selling them, in effect, to the Soviet Union, and they got caught. There will be some, as years go on, there are other people that are implicated in this, and there's going to be some debate. Who was really guilty and who was not guilty, but maybe was framed for it or wrongly accused. Well, we may never know the actual truth on this, but we do know that atomic secrets were passed, and the Rosenbergs definitely took the fall for this. And whether they were the real conspirators and the ones most guilty or not, again, not sure. But this is a scandal of the highest proportions, right? Because to most Americans, communism is the arch enemy, the Soviet Union is the arch enemy. You would never fathom helping the enemy. You would never betray America to aid or help the Soviets during the Cold War, and that's exactly what happened here. And so this is a major, of course, scandal, and well, you saw what happened. It's also at this time, while all this is going on, all these events are kind of happening simultaneously, really interesting, that a senator in the US government named Joseph McCarthy stands up one day and he says, basically, I have a piece of paper here in my hand that has a list of Americans working within our government who are communists and communist spies. And most people just kind of think he's crazy. He must be off his rocker. He's he's just trying to get attention, right? Trying to get some publicity because he was kind of a little known senator overall. Okay, and he's making this crazy accusation that we got all kinds of communist infiltrators in our government, getting an American government paycheck and betraying our country. And so people didn't believe him. They thought he was crazy. And then he gets up and he says, "Well, I have not only do I have some proof of this, I have more people to accuse, and some of these people are work for our U.S. military, our Army. Some of them are top people in the Army, And then the American people are like, no, there's no way that military personnel would be loyal, that would be disloyal to the U.S. and be helping out the Soviets and be communists. It just was unfathomable to the American people. They could not wrap their minds around that. So at that point, when he accuses people within the military of being communist, they say, okay, that's enough, McCarthy. We're going to put you on trial. And this is exactly what he wanted to do. He wanted to get on TV and show this stuff. But his opponent said, perfect. We'll get him on TV and he'll discredit himself. He'll look like a fool. And so for a couple of weeks, Americans are glued to their TV sets at night while you have the Army-McCarthy hearings. And he's trying to prove that his accusations are accurate, that he has information to back them up, that top people in our government and our military are communist spies. And, you know, it turns out, even though people totally discredited him, the media just calls him a liar and a fraud. Top brass in the United States calls him a liar and a fraud. And he is basically a broken man. He is, the American people come away from this thinking that he was just a joke. And he is a broken man. He will basically die like a year later or so. Nobody ever believes him again. Well, anything he says, right? And he's just kind of written off in history as this imposter and this guy that made a bunch of false accusations. Well, turns out some of what he was saying way back in the early 1950s turned out to be true. As history has gone on, reports and documents have surfaced that have shown that McCarthy was not just making it all up. He was not just doing it all for attention, but that quite a few of the people he was accusing of being communist spies within our government were actually communist spies. And it's actually kind of interesting because the Soviets also came out when the Soviet Union fell. The Russians came out and said, "Yeah, you know that guy Joseph McCarthy, who you all you Americans just thought was just a liar. No, he wasn't. He actually was telling the truth in a lot of cases, and we have the records to prove it. We would keep records of who within your government was helping us, the Soviets, and and they started naming names and providing these documents. And so his reputation was ruined at the time, but history has vindicated him to some degree. And I don't know if that's any consolation to him, of course, but it is for the people who believed him. Okay, and kind of crazy how it worked out. Also, during the time that McCarthy is making his accusations, a war breaks out, a hot war breaks out, the Korean War. North Korea was a pro-communist part of the country, and South Korea was the anti-communist part of the country. And there's no way in just a few minutes that I can do the Korean War justice. The Korean War is, as we will see, called the Forgotten War. It goes from 1950 to 53, and so many young American men are involved in this war, many of whom were World War II vets, and then a bunch of young guys that had been too young to fight in World War II that decided they wanted to be in the military and fight a war. And so you have this pro-communist versus this anti-communist section of a country playing out. And this really kind of started back, well, it goes back a long time, but it really kind of started in 1945. Japan had controlled Korea during World War II, but once the Japanese are defeated, the Allies agreed to divide Korea into two places, kind of this communist, pro-Soviet, if you will, north, and this anti-communist, pro-democracy south. Well, in June of 1950, war breaks out when North Korean troops stream across what we call the 38th parallel, the dividing line between North and South Korea. And they're trying to basically reunite Korea all into one body and being controlled by the communists. Okay, the North Koreans are trying to overrun the South and make it communist and make all of Korea communist. And so the United Nations is now on high alert, and the alarms are going off as the North Korean troops pour across the border. And so the United Nations gets involved, and they're going to use their military arm to intervene. Here you can see a map of the Korean War, like I said, 50 to 53. And this is going to be just a crazy war. It's going to be a brutal war. The fighting is just as intense oftentimes as any time during World War II. And it starts, like I said, with the North Koreans going across that 38th parallel line into South Korea. They go all the way down by September of 1950 to just that little southeastern corner of South Korea, that little spot that's left. And that's the front line in September of 1950. And it's at that point that the United Nations troops show up. Okay, and I'll show you kind of who their leader was in just a second, the UN troops leader. And these were mostly American soldiers, but soldiers from other countries too got involved. And they are going to try to push back the North Koreans. And you can see they do push them back. By January of 1951, they push them back farther north. And they, eventually we end up pushing the communists back all the way up near China. And that's when China gets involved. And so pretty soon, instead of fighting a bunch of North Koreans, you're fighting mostly Chinese because China's communist, right? North Korea is their neighbor. They don't want North Korea, which is a buffer zone to them, to fall to anti-communist forces, to fall to the United Nations forces, to mostly American forces, right? And so the Chinese pour down across the Yalu River there, which is the border between China and North Korea, and the Chinese start fighting. And so mainly it becomes an American versus Chinese fight, even though it's the Korean War, okay? And it is bloody, it is freezing, it is, temperatures are negative 30 degrees, negative 40 degrees. I mean, it's horrible. And after 3 bloody long years of fighting, and the front line moving back and forth, you can see where the ceasefire line in July of 1953 occurs, that green line toward the middle. Both sides exhausted, so many casualties on both sides, realized that they could probably fight forever and neither side's going to give up. And so they agreed to a ceasefire to stop fighting. And the whole irony of this is mainly where they decided to stop fighting and the line they established was pretty much the dividing line between North and South Korea before the war started. So really the boundaries hadn't changed. Nothing had really changed. It was just a bunch of dead for the North Koreans, for the South Koreans, for the Chinese, for the Americans. And I mean, you talk about crazy, right? And that's what the Korean War was, though. It was, and like I said, it was brutal. It was bloody. It was nasty. But it's oftentimes forgotten. It's not a war that Americans think about, especially. We think about other wars. We think about the Revolutionary War and the Civil War and World War I and World War II and Vietnam, but we don't think about the Korean War very often. And it's a shame because these Korean War vets were some of the toughest, fiercest soldiers we ever had in any war in our history, and some of the bravest guys you could ever meet. Well, the Korean War, like I said, what's going to be the results? Well, like I said, 3 years long, about 55,000 Americans die in battle. 55,000 of our young men will perish in this, and another 113,000 wounded. I mean, it's brutal. Basically, the Korean War is almost like a precursor to the Vietnam War. That would be a decade later. It's basically a preview, okay? Communist North, anti-communist South, we get involved, okay? And it's just horrific. But that is the Korean War. And like I said, it's often called the forgotten war because people don't remember. We don't think about it. And it's a shame that we don't think about it because, man alive, when you start studying the Korean War, you come to appreciate what happened there as much as you do, anything that happened in any other war that we've ever fought. Well, the guy put in charge of the United Nations forces in the Korean War was General Douglas MacArthur. I mean, you talk about a crazy career and a fascinating career. The head U.S. general in the Pacific in World War II. He had basically become the leader, kind of overseeing the democratization of Japan for about 5 years, 6 years after World War II, and then becomes the head of the United Nations, mainly U.S., but the United Nations forces in the Korean War, and it's his job to knock those the North Korean communists back when the UN first lands there in that little pocket in South Korea, and then to try to defeat the Chinese forces when they come down. Eventually, General MacArthur will be fired by President Truman because MacArthur wants to take drastic measures in the Korean War. He wants to absolutely not only win and conquer North Korea, okay, he wants to destroy China because we have our troops way up there near the Chinese border at one point, and he wants to use atomic bombs on China. In fact, he suggested using upwards of 50 atomic bombs to just destroy China and their communist influence. Um, I think he, to some degree, saw the communist influence that would be totally entrenched in China before very long. We're going to remember, this is 1950-51. China just became communist in 1949. So MacArthur says, hey, if we let them continue with communism, it's going to be bad news for the U.S., for the world down the road. And so he says, hey, let's just get the job done now. And he just kind of kept up with Truman on this idea. And Truman finally got tired of it and fired him, which is very controversial because MacArthur was one of our best generals probably in our history, right, that we've ever had. And so, but Truman said, no, I got to fire you. And so MacArthur went out gracefully and graciously and gave a famous speech, and where he basically explained what happened, and that was the end of his political or his military career, which ended because of politics, really. But yeah, but that MacArthur was our guy for most of the Korean War, heading up the UN forces. So, to summarize then, as mentioned, when the war ends, the dividing line, the boundary between North and South Korea is pretty much the same as it was when the war started. Okay? It's basically known as the 38th parallel. And today, if you ever want to see proof of what communism can do to a country and how it can absolutely ruin and destroy people, look at North Korea. And if you want to see proof at what capitalism and democracy can do, if implemented correctly, into a country, look at South Korea. In all the years since the Korean War ended, and when the war ends, North Korea stays communist, South Korea stays anti-communist. Okay, North Korea has not progressed. It's like they're living in the Dark Ages. It's like they're living 1,000 years ago with their limited technology. The average person has a very terrible life. Not enough food, not enough supplies. It's just horrible. They're completely brainwashed into worshiping the leader of North Korea, whoever it may be at the time. Okay, and it's just crazy. It's just there's been no progress. Whereas in South Korea, if you look, it is a bustling, wealthy nation where people have been educated and progress. Okay, South Korea is known for some of the best work ethic in the world. Maybe a little too extreme at times, right? But the South Koreans have blossomed. Okay, their country has blossomed because of the system that was implemented there after the war. And North Korea has, not blossomed. Let's put it that way, mildly. They have work camps that are, labor camps where people go to die if they've spoken out against the leader of the country or the government, or not only do you go if you speak out, but your family goes. And I mean, it is just so repressive and so crazy. So that's what's happened in Korea today. But when the war ends, it's basically the same as it was in the beginning, with the boundaries and with the communist North and the anti-communist South. So what does the Korean War accomplish? I mean, a lot of people in America today would say, well, we kind of lost then, didn't we? We lost. If you talk to the Korean War veterans, they're very adamant. No, we won. We prevented communism from taking hold of South Korea, and look at South Korea today. And so look at all those lives that we have basically saved, and generations of lives that have really been saved because of what we did. So, and I'm not going to argue with the vets. Those guys are hardcore, okay? So, in the end, everybody has their own opinion about what the Korean War results really were, but the veterans of the war say absolutely. We fought for something. We fought to help those people of South Korea, and we did. One of the reasons we got involved in Korea was because we were afraid at least this was what was advertised at the time, of course, to the American people, of the domino theory. The idea that if one nation falls to communism, then its neighbors around it will also fall like dominoes. And so we couldn't let this happen, right? North Korea was communist. We couldn't let South Korea be communist. Well, the same thing is going to take place in Southeast Asia with, the likes of Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia. Okay, that Southeast Asia region of the world becomes a hotbed. Now, how does that happen? It happens because the year after the Korean War ends, Vietnam, which had been for centuries, Vietnam, had fought off China for its independence and fierce, those Vietnamese were fiercely tough, loyal people. They didn't want to be ruled by a foreign country. Well, then before World War II, they'd become a colony of France, and Vietnam was called French Indochina. World War II happens, the Japanese come in, the French are kicked out. Then World War II ends, the Japanese are defeated, the French try to come back and say, hey, we want to be back in. And the Vietnamese are like, no, 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 no. We're going to be our own nation. You're not coming back. And so they battle the French, basically, for a while over control of the nation or the country of Vietnam. Well, finally, in 1954, the North, or Vietnam is divided. The North becomes communist. Like I said, this is a year after the Korean War ends. So I don't know if they were just looking at the blueprint of North communist, South anti-communist, or what. But the North is communist and the South is anti-communist. Okay, and so you can see the writing on the wall here, right? You can see what's going to happen. Well, eventually the North communists are going to want to take over the South and make that region communist as well. And so one thing leads to another, and about a decade down the road after this division, we're going to see a full-blown war start in Vietnam. So I just told you a little bit about Vietnam. There's a whole presentation on the Vietnam War that we'll be covering later on. But for the time being, I wanted to kind of give you the background of how Vietnam, how things got to, to where they were in Vietnam, why things played out the way they did. But another nation that comes into view at this time is Israel. Israel is created as a country in 1948 as a home for the Jews. It's to be a Jewish homeland. Most Jews in the world during World War II times lived in Europe, and many of them were victims of the Holocaust. From France all the way to the Soviet Union and everywhere in between. And so the world obviously feels very bad about what happened to the Jews. And they say, we're going to give you a homeland. It's yours. It's a nation of your own that you can settle if you choose. And so in 1948, 3 years after World War II ends, Israel is created. Now, this is very controversial because for the people who lived there, the area beforehand had been known as Palestine. And England had controlled it for a long time. And in Palestine, it was a lot of Arabs, Muslims who lived there. And basically, the United Nations comes in and says, okay, here's what's going to happen. This Israel country is going to be formed, and the Palestinians, okay, the Muslims that live there, or the Arabs that live there, you can stay in two areas. You have what's called the Gaza Strip. There you can see on the map, Gaza, and the West Bank. Those are your areas. But the rest of the area, you have to get out. If you're there now, you got to get out, and the Jews are moving in. And so, obviously you can see that, or you can guess that this didn't go over real well with some people who were in the area already. And but why? Why would the world pick this area to be a Jewish homeland? Well, to understand that, you got to understand history. This goes back thousands of years. Okay, this goes back to Abraham in the Bible and Moses and the children of Israel. And okay, this is the area of the world that the Jews, okay, the children of Israel, and then became known as the Jews, that they believe is the promised land that God reserved for them. This is the land that God set aside for them to inhabit. And throughout history, they've inhabited it, and then they've been kicked out, and then they've taken it back, and then they've been conquered in war and taken off as slaves, and they've taken it back, and then they, and then they've been scattered again. And so this is the land that is chosen for them to come back to in 1948 as a homeland. It remains the same today, and as you can imagine, the Gaza residents and the West Bank residents, okay, many of whom are Muslims. They don't get along. They're the Palestinians, right? They don't get along with the Jews. Different religion, Muslim versus Jewish, and they're still bitter. A lot of these people are still bitter about losing that area, that is now Israel, and so they're always fighting each other. There's always rockets being launched from one place to the other, okay, and then vice versa. And there's going in as a suicide bomber, going into an open market and blowing themselves and as many of the other guys up as they can. And so it's crazy. But and honestly, if you look around Egypt or look around Israel, you got Egypt, you got Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. Israel is surrounded by Muslim countries, by countries that, if they could, would conquer Israel tomorrow and take back that land. And so who becomes Israel's greatest ally as soon as it's created? Well, you can probably take a guess, right? The United States. The United States has a very powerful Jewish influence, a lot of Jewish money, way back in that era and today. In fact, interesting enough, there's more Jews that live in the U.S. than live in Israel, okay, today. And so a lot of top government officials and business leaders and so forth have been and still are Jewish, and so they have a vested interest in supporting Israel. And so Israel gets a lot of their weapons from us to protect themselves, and if they were to be attacked by outside neighbors, then of course we would jump in. But that's kind of the story of Israel. It's a really interesting place when you start studying its history. Now, toward the end of the 1950s, let's just finish off this presentation with what happens that kind of it's not good for the U.S. So most of the 50s were really good for the U.S. Yes, we got the Cold War stuff. We're battling, people who are giving up our bomb secrets. We're trying to build bigger bombs than the Soviets and all this stuff. But for the most part, the American life, okay, was really good in the 50s. And it was fun for a lot of people. Pop culture was good. The music, rock and roll, and the drive-ins and the diners, and and TV comes around big time, and the movies are good, and so life is overall really good for people. But politically, at the end of the 50s, we suffer some setbacks. Okay, and this is on President Eisenhower's watch, and he's the big anti-communist, right? So Americans are kind of perplexed at what to do. Well, the first setback that happens is that Fidel Castro becomes the communist leader of Cuba in 1959. There was basically a civil war there as well, like there'd been in China a decade earlier. And out of this civil war, Fidel Castro prevails. And he is an open communist. He's going to buddy up right away, of course, with the Soviet Union and with China, mostly the Soviet Union, though. And of course, he's going to get weapons from the Soviet Union. He's going to get supplies from the Soviet Union. And so why is that a big deal? It's Cuba, right? Who cares? Well, Cuba is an island in the Caribbean, only 90 miles away from Florida. And so what are Americans afraid of? Well, if this guy's communist and he buddies up with the Soviet Union, what could the Soviet Union do in Cuba? Well, they could put weapons there. They could put missiles pointed at the U.S. there. They could do anything. And so Americans all of a sudden start to go, this is no good. This guy is going to mean bad news for the U.S. And he really was over the years. I mean, he was in power for forever. He was in power for like 50 years, okay? And he was a pain in the U.S. side for a lot of that time. Also, sadly enough, Cuba, which had been a pretty nice place, I mean, it's a tropical place, beautiful to begin with, but pretty first world in a lot of ways before Castro goes kind of, it suffers the fate of communism, let's put it that way. After Castro takes over, it just, technology stopped, progress stopped, and poverty increased. Okay, he cracks down with his henchmen on anybody who spoke out against him, and it's becomes a kind of a tyrannical place to be. And anybody that wants can tell you otherwise, and they'd be wrong, because you can study Cuban history, study what people that lived through the Castro regime said about it, and it was not good for them. But that's what communism does. It goes into a place and it ruins it. This is what happens. So Cuba is no exception. Well, the United States has all these hydrogen bombs now, which are way more powerful than the atomic bomb. And the Soviets also have the hydrogen bomb, and countries are falling to communism, and countries are being divided, and from Korea to Vietnam, and then of course you got China having fallen at the end of the 40s, and Cuba's going to be falling at the end of the 50s, and so we decide we need to test these hydrogen bombs. We got to make sure they'll do the job if we need them, and of course if we have to use even one, it's going to mean World War III, right? And so we need to do these tests though in a place that's kind of remote, in the middle of nowhere. Okay, that's not going to really, ideally not going to affect people, not going to, and then people aren't going to know what we're doing. I got to keep it top secret. And so we picked these series of islands out in the middle of the Pacific called the Bikini Islands. And from 1954 to 58, the U.S. conducts 19 hydrogen bomb tests there. We also, most Americans didn't realize at the time, and still most of them don't know because most people don't study history, we chose locations within the U.S. itself, and these were usually out in the middle of the desert, okay? And from New Mexico to Nevada, but out in the middle of nowhere, okay? And we would conduct tests there as well. And we would put our own U.S. soldiers, on the task of, okay, you're going to be in this trench, certain amount of distance away from the bomb blast, and we want you to, after the bomb goes off, I want you to come out of the trench and go toward the blast, after it's safe to do so, of course, right? And see the effects. And well, what the government was doing in the end was really seeing the effects of the bomb, not on the landscape, but on the soldiers, on the humans. And almost all the guys ended up, getting cancer from the radiation. They ended up dying. I mean, hardly anybody was left from those experimental groups, you know, in within too many years after these tests were done. So pretty crazy. But we have to test these. We got to test our toys, right? Because in case we need them, we got to make sure that they will do the job and work. So I told you one of the setbacks at the end of the 50s was Cuba and falling to communism, right? And really, I guess it probably could be a setback that, well, for sure, a setback for the effects these hydrogen bomb tests had on our own soldiers that were involved. But also the fact that we just had to detonate a bunch of them just to see what they would do, wasn't good for anything. Okay. But then at the end of the 50s, another setback happens. And this is really the first time that Americans start to freak out, because now it appears we're falling behind the Soviets. We're not just even or maybe a little bit ahead of them. We're falling behind. What in the world? Well, it comes in the form of these ICBMs. One of the main things in the Cold War was the space race. Who could get to space first? Okay, explore that final frontier of space. And so we would try to send rockets up into the air, and the Soviets would do the same thing. Well, the Soviets kind of perfect these ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are missiles they could launch from launch pads that would go up into the air. They could, they could carry humans. They could carry, other animals. They could, whatever, right? But these are going to basically be your first kind of your first space rockets, your first space shuttles for space exploration. And the Soviets figure out how to get their rockets into space. Their missiles are going up. And we're trying our own versions of ICBMs, and they're not working. Our scientists are trying to build our stuff at NASA, and our missiles are going up and coming back down, are going up and turning sideways and blowing up, and they're not working. And so the Soviets have got ahead of us in the ICBM category. And we're thinking, what? Oh my gosh, this is bad. This is dangerous. Not only are they going to beat us to space, but worse, these missiles that they can actually successfully launch, they could put them in Cuba and launch them at us. They could put them, they could launch them from the Soviet Union at us. And their stuff works and ours doesn't. And so these missiles could be used to be launched at us carrying bombs, carrying hydrogen bombs. Now, we had airplanes still. That's the thing the Soviets couldn't do, is they couldn't carry their bombs in their airplanes because their airplanes weren't big and beefy and strong enough. But we had airplanes that could carry the tonnage of the bombs, okay? And we could drop the bombs from airplanes. But you can send a bomb a heck of a lot faster someplace if you can send it on a missile. And so the Soviets have these ICBMs, we don't, we've fallen behind, we start to panic. The Soviets will use their ICBMs, like I said, to launch things into space as well and get ahead in the space race. And so the first one they're really going to do that is going to be, world headlines, and the Soviets have proven that they're ahead of us now in this space race, is Sputnik. Sputnik is the Soviet satellite that became the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth, 1957. It went all the way around the world, and it worked, and we're not even close in our technology to duplicating this. So like, as you can imagine, Americans are freaking out. We're falling behind. The Soviets are getting ahead. What if they conquer us? What if they attack us? And all these worst case scenarios start popping into people's heads, and we're imagining their students, in high school figuring out quantum physics, and our kids are, dancing to Elvis songs, okay? And we're afraid that we're losing and we're going to get conquered and we're all going to be, forced, into communism and the worst thing of all time, right? And so this becomes kind of the mentality. We've got to catch up. And then finally, as if we needed kind of another setback, we get this one. I told you our airplane technology is better than the Soviets. Okay, we can transport weapons via our airplanes, but we also develop a spy plane that we think, okay, we can send this thing so high in the air, the Soviets could never hit it down. Their ICBMs, their technology is good, but not that good. They can't reach as high as our U-2 planes can go. So this U-2 spy plane that we sent over Soviet territory flew 15 miles high. To give you an idea, when you fly in an airplane, if you're going to go from here to New York, your cruising altitude is usually 30 to 35,000 feet. That's about 6 miles in the air, give or take a little bit, but it's about 6 miles. You know how high you are at 6 miles. Well, 15 miles this U-2 spy plane could fly in the air. And we thought the Soviets could never knock it down. Well, they did. They saw it, they shot it down, and the American pilot is captured. Okay, and eventually he's turned over to the Americans in a kind of a prisoner exchange, prisoner swap, if you will. But so the Soviets now have Cuba on their side, 90 miles from Florida. They have ICBM technology. They send Sputnik up, and they shoot our U-2 plane down. Oh my goodness! At the end of the 50s, we had some losses here, some defeats, and we need some wins. We're not used to being second place, okay? We're used to being, the leader of the pack. And so we need some victories. And it's just at the time when the election of 1960 for a new president is happening, and Americans will elect somebody that they think will give them wins again, that will restore confidence, boost morale for the American people. And that person's going to come in the form of one John F. Kennedy. So that is what happens in the 1950s, mainly part of the Cold War, 40s, 50s, and a little bit into the 60s. But this is the Cold War as it gets going, a time of competition in every single way between the US and the Soviet Union and all their respective friends. Okay, so Cold War, interesting time to be alive. We came really close to World War III a few times. Luckily, we avoided it. But ask your grandparents. who really remember the Cold War and lived through it and lived through some of these things. Ask them what it was like and what the feelings were like during these times. And sometimes tensions got pretty high. So pretty crazy time to be alive. There's your Cold War.